why, and how Korea ended up into two separated countries. Imagine a family dinner where half the table can't speak to the other half. Sounds absurd, right? Yet this is the reality for many Korean families today. Picture this: a grandmother in Seoul who hasn't seen her grandchildren in Pyongyang for decades, or siblings separated by a border they can't cross. How did a single nation with over 5,000 years of shared history suddenly split in two? Today, we're going to unravel this geopolitical puzzle that has shaped East Asia for over 7 decades. Buckle up, because the story of Korea's division is a roller coaster ride through 20th century history. Historical background: how it all started. Let's start with a quick trip back in time. For centuries, Korea was a unified kingdom. The Goryeo dynasty, from which we get the name Korea, ruled from 918 to 1392. Then came the Joseon dynasty, lasting until 1897. During this time, Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom because it tried to keep foreign influences at bay. But by the late 19th century, this isolation became harder to maintain. Imagine Korea as a small fish in a pond with some very big, hungry fish circling around. These big fish were countries like China, Russia, and Japan, all eager to take a bite out of Korea. Japan, in particular, had its eye on the prize. In 1910, after years of increasing influence, Japan finally swallowed Korea whole, turning it into a colony. This wasn't a friendly takeover. The Japanese tried to erase Korean culture, forcing people to adopt Japanese names and banning the Korean language in schools. But Koreans didn't take this lying down. Resistance movements sprung up, fighting for independence. One famous incident was the March First movement in 1919, where Koreans took to the streets, waving their national flag and shouting "Munse!" Long live Korean independence. World War II and its aftermath. It's the why. Fast forward to World War II. As the tide turned against Japan, the Allied powers started planning for a post-war world. At the Cairo Conference in 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek promised Korea its independence in due course. It was like telling a teenager they could have the car keys, eventually. But here's where things get tricky. As World War II was ending in August 1945, the U.S. was scrambling to figure out what to do with Korea. Picture this: 2 American officials, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, huddled over a National Geographic map at 10 p.m., trying to decide how to divide Korea between U.S. and Soviet forces. They chose the 38th parallel almost arbitrarily. It was just a line that roughly split the country in half, while keeping the capital, Seoul, in the American zone. 38th parallel, in simple terms, is the line of latitude 38 degrees north in East Asia, which roughly marks the border between North Korea and South Korea, also known today as the Demilitarized Zone. So, when Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Korea suddenly found itself cut in two. Soviet troops occupied the north, while U.S. troops took the south. It was supposed to be temporary, but as we now know, temporary solutions have a funny way of becoming permanent. The Cold War context. Now, let's zoom out a bit. The world was entering a new era, the Cold War. Imagine 2 kids on a playground, each convinced their way of playing is the best, and trying to get everyone else to play their way. That's basically what the US and the Soviet Union were doing, but on a global scale. Korea became a battleground in this ideological tug-of-war. In the north, with Soviet backing, Kim Il-sung established a communist government, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, in 1948. Down south, with US support, Syngmong Rhee set up a capitalist government, the Republic of Korea, ROK, also in 1948. But neither side was happy with this arrangement. Both Kim and Rhee wanted to unify Korea under their rule. This tension exploded into full-scale war on June 25, 1950. when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. The Korean War had begun. This wasn't just a Korean affair. The United Nations, led by the US, sent troops to support South Korea. Then, in a surprise move, China entered the war on North Korea's side. For 3 years, the conflict raged, with the front line yo-yoing up and down the peninsula. By the time an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, millions had died, and the country was in ruins. And here's the kicker. This wasn't even a proper peace treaty. Technically, the two Koreas are still at war today. Post-war developments. After the war, North and South Korea took very different paths. In the North, Kim Il-sung established a political system centered around himself and his family. Imagine a country where the same family has been in charge for 3 generations, almost like a royal dynasty. That's North Korea. The South, on the other hand, went through some turbulent times, but eventually developed into an economic powerhouse. Ever heard of Samsung or Hyundai? Yep, they're South Korean companies. South Korea also transitioned to democracy, though it took until the 1980s for this to fully take root. Despite the divide, there have been attempts at reconciliation. In 1972, both sides signed a joint statement, agreeing in principle to peaceful reunification. From 1998 to 2008, South Korea pursued the Sunshine Policy, trying to warm relations with the North through economic cooperation and humanitarian aid. More recently, we've seen summits between North and South Korean leaders, with handshakes and promises of peace that make headlines around the world, but these moments of warmth have been interspersed with periods of high tension. North Korea's nuclear program, in particular, has been a major source of concern for South Korea and the international community. Conclusion. So, here we are today. The Korean Peninsula remains divided, a living remnant of the Cold War. This separation has led to drastically different societies, economies, and ways of life on either side of the 38th parallel. While South Korea has become a global cultural and economic force, K-pop, anyone, North Korea remains largely isolated from the world.